Hello and welcome to the Two Ball Brothers and a Microphone podcast. This is one of the Ball Brothers, Danny, and I'm here with someone from Three Wheel. I'm here with Eric Bowden. How are you doing, Eric?
Oh, I'm doing fantastic, Danny. How are you
Awesome.
today?
I'm doing great. It's a Friday afternoon. All is well. I can't complain. It was a great week, and so just looking forward to the weekend. I've got a date tomorrow night where Amy and I are going to go back down to Buckhead and go where we used to live and go wander around, go do a little bit of shopping. So I'm looking forward to that. How about you?
All right, time in the old neighborhood.
Yes.
Oh, it's gonna be a weekend of rest and relaxation.
I love it.
I have
I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. So what I wanted to talk to you about is Azure Search. Now, we've done plenty of content on the website about SharePoint Search, and I'd like to understand more about what you're doing. Sort of why did you start wanting to learn about this? Let's get started with just sort of what prompted going and learning more about Azure Search.
Sure, sure, yeah. So of course, search is a great feature of SharePoint. It's a strong feature. The fast search engine became part of SharePoint in 2010. There's a lot that can be built around search in SharePoint. We've had projects which are really search focused projects in SharePoint. That is the only exposure that I really have to the fast search engine. I understand that it is a technology that precedes its usage in SharePoint, but it's a well-respected feature in SharePoint. And then I'm hearing, okay, there is the fast search engine. There's Azure Search, which is a lot like the search that you're accustomed to seeing and working with in SharePoint, and that really piqued my interest. I'm saying, well, SharePoint Search already has a great reputation with me. It's a highly used feature, but what is this Azure Search? I'm hearing it's a lot like SharePoint, and I want to find out more about it.
Awesome. Awesome. So how did you get started with learning more about it?
Oh, with my favorite go-to learning source, which is Pluralsight.
Awesome.
So I head right into Pluralsight and found a great course called Adding Search Abilities to Your Apps with Azure Search by Chad Campbell. So this is it was a great course, provided a really good high level and a deep understanding of how I can get started with search in Azure.
Cool. So let's dive into it. So let's maybe start at the 25,000 foot level. We'll call it that. And what were some of the things to get started with Azure Search? What were some of the things that you picked up?
Sure. Yeah. And the good news is that, for one thing, if you are, if you're familiar with SharePoint Search, Azure Search will be equally familiar. There's some translation of terms, some things seem to have been renamed. For example, in Azure, they use the word score, whereas I'm more used to hearing the word ranking. In SharePoint, they use facets. In Azure, whereas they use ranking. Where they use refiners in SharePoint. So there's some translation to occur, but in large part, it's very similar to SharePoint. Now, I start off by sort of building, there are really four sort of pillars of knowledge with Azure Search. The first is you're going to create a search service in Azure. So you go in, create a search service. It's actually a fairly minimal set of inputs to create a search service. You're going to give it a name. You're going to give it a resource group and choose the pricing, the sizing of your Azure service, a few other fields, but it's fairly minimal. So there's your search service, pillar one. Pillar two is you're going to create indexes, which in SharePoint, we're not used to creating indexes. In SharePoint, you have one index.
Okay.
But in Azure Search, you can create more than one. And then from there, you're creating fields for that index. So this is equivalent, if you kind of translate over into the SharePoint world, this is the equivalent of configuring managed properties or crawled properties and managed properties. It's really both of those. you're doing in Azure Search. You're configuring your fields. So at that point, you have a search service and you have an index. And then the third step is you're going to need to get content into your index. And that's accomplished with the API. So there's an API call. You're going to push content up into Azure. There is also, there are indexers. There's indexers capability, which on the SharePoint world, you would know that as a crawler.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, that leads me to the fourth pillar, which is searching the index. So you're going to, execute API queries against the Azure Search Service to, find your results. And of course, all four of those topics are very rich, or certainly indexes and searching are very, very rich, and you can go very deep in, what Azure provides for you. But I think that, a really good key takeaway for somebody who's familiar with SharePoint search, and they're thinking, what is this Azure search thing, and what are the complexities, and really how can I get into it? Just keep in mind those four sort of pillars of knowledge there.
Awesome. And what are you typically, are you indexing SharePoint, or what are you, is it just a website that you've created, or an app, or what's some of the typical things for you to index?
It can pretty much be anything. So I am at the, sort of the beginner, the intro level of knowledge myself with this. But, the way that I see Azure Search being used versus, SharePoint Search is Azure Search is, I think going to be appropriate for these sort of isolated solutions. So it's a solution that has an isolated set of data. It's not, part of your intranet. It's not part of an aggregate, your enterprise corpus of content. It's, and you are, you can push any record. So it can be documents or it can be records with, fields. And then also, of course, you can configure the indexers that I talked about. So you can crawl content sources. It can crawl SQL databases, Cosmos database, blob storage, a couple of other content sources. So it's a variety of content that you can push into Azure, into the index.
And then I imagine you have some way of scheduling when the crawls occur and whether they're incremental or full crawls and those types of things?
Yes, exactly. Very similar process as you're familiar with in SharePoint. So you can schedule that the indexers, when those are going to crawl over your content sources.
I wonder, how does this fit into, I guess, if somebody is using this Azure service and they're indexing content, and I guess for our customers who might be, let's take SharePoint on-prem, and they're on-prem for a certain reason where they want to keep that data on within their environments, this wouldn't be a solution they could go with because you're actually pulling that content up into Azure. And am I reading that right?
Yep, you're right. Yeah, so it's a cloud service, and what you're pulling into the cloud are those elements that you want to search.
Mm-hmm.
So, which most likely, if you have concerns about data and you're keeping that data on-prem, most likely the aspects of it that you want to search are also sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
But it is it's a cloud-hosted solution in Azure.
How does security and security trimming fit into this?
That is a good question, and something that I haven't fully explored yet. I was actually discussing that with the team yesterday.
Okay.
There are two aspects of security to keep in mind with Azure Search. The first is your access to the service itself, and access to the service itself is covered using access keys. So a number of services, Azure Functions is one that I'm familiar with in Azure that support the idea of access keys, and essentially it's a sort of coarse access mechanism where you can create these access keys, which simply give you access, to call the service itself. But then the next step is going to be saying, well, what about the specific items in the index how are the specific items security trimmed. Folks that are accustomed to SharePoint, we're accustomed to the SharePoint search index being security trimmed. So you execute a search in SharePoint, you don't see results back for content that you don't have access to. I don't know what that story is yet in Azure. I would imagine that I think you're on your own, but I don't know that for sure.
Okay.
Where you're going to need to be coding in either a mechanism to store the access control list as part of the search index. So that's sort of a front loading method, or the other side is, when you retrieve those contents, you'll have to have a mechanism to, decipher if the users have access to it.
Any projects that's from your past where you now that you're starting to learn about this, where you see you might have used this on the project, or maybe taken a closer look at this?
Well, sure. I mean, a recent project was a knowledge base solution built on SharePoint. It was essentially a search focused project. A lot of filtering, refiners, a lot of logic. We were doing promoting of results, increasing the ranking of specific results, and doing some tuning and so forth. This potentially could have been a good candidate for that, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that the solution didn't have deep security requirements, security trimming requirements.
Gotcha.
So we needed to secure content in buckets. For this project, they were by client. So it wasn't down to the individual level. So, the security trimming aspects wouldn't have been an issue. But then also, this solution, that knowledge-based solution, it was a very specific built application for this knowledge-based purpose, for a mission-critical purpose at this company and for our client. And looking at, building it on SharePoint. SharePoint is more of an enterprise-wide, intranet solution. And so this might have been a better fit in Azure because it kind of takes what is this purpose-built, mission-critical application and kind of puts it into its own, isolated environment where, you can really tune things and you can make configuration changes that only affect this application. It has no possibility of affecting, the rest of your SharePoint environment.
Gotcha. Anything else as far as like getting started with Azure Search? You mentioned Pluralsight as being a great resource. Anything else as you've started to take a look at this?
I just recommend just dive in.
Yeah.
When you get there is of the pricing tiers, there's a free pricing tier for developers. As you'll see from the Pluralsight course, and there are other walkthroughs that you can find. Postman is a great resource for executing those search queries.
Gotcha. What are the search? What are you writing search queries in? Is it a certain language? What is that?
It's actually it's called the Lucene search syntax.
Okay.
Well, let me take a step back. There are actually two.
Okay.
There's what they call it. There's a simple query language, and there's a full query language, which to kind of translate those onto the SharePoint side, you might be familiar with keyword query syntax or keyword queries, and then there's full text query. That's what we had in SharePoint, and then in Azure, we have what they call simple and they call full. And that full syntax, it's using what they call the Lucene search syntax, which Lucene is a search engine that goes back a number of years that has eventually been ported into .NET, and then we're able to access it through Azure.
And Lucene was like I thought I've heard of that in the past, like an open source search engine. I could be
Right,
wrong.
right. Yeah, I was actually, it started, I think, in the late 90s,
Yeah.
99 or so, and I think was originally a Java-based project, and then it was ultimately open sourced and ported to a number of probably half a dozen or so
I
platforms.
I thought it was originally a show like Lucene and Shirley, right?
Exactly. Well, yeah, it's pretty funny. I was even taking another direction. I was looking up. I was trying to understand the history of it myself, and I misspelled it. And there is apparently a protein called leucine. If you
Ah.
spell it a little bit differently, and believe it or not, there is a search engine out there for the protein called leucine. I don't know. They use, yeah,
Nice, nice, nice. Well, I think this was
yeah,
great. This is great for getting us started off. I appreciate you taking the time to do this, sir.
sure.
Absolutely. And thanks everybody for listening. Have a wonderful day. Hopefully, good luck with learning more about Azure Search and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. Bye bye.